Waris Dirie, the desert flower who found her voice. The world knew her face. It appeared in fashion magazines, on glamorous runways, in photographs taken by some of the world's most celebrated photographers. She had escaped the Somali desert, crossed continents, and entered a world of beauty, wealth, and fame. People looked at Waris Dirie and thought they were seeing an extraordinary success story, but they were seeing only half of it, because beneath the beautiful clothes, beneath the photograph, beneath the applause, Waris was carrying a story she had never told the world. A story that began when she was still a little girl. For years, she remained silent until one day, at the height of her success, someone came to interview the famous model. They wanted to talk about fashion. Waris wanted to talk about something else, something real. And when she finally spoke, the world began to see a different woman, not simply a model, not simply a survivor, but a woman who had discovered that everything she had endured could become something more than a painful memory. It could become a voice. And that voice could become a weapon against an injustice that had remained hidden for generations. But to understand how Waris Dirie found that voice, we must return to where her story began, far away from the cameras, far away from London, far away from the runways of Paris and New York, to the vast Somali desert, where a little girl was learning how to survive. Her name was Waris. It meant desert flower. Welcome to Moonlight Tales Africa, a place where African stories come alive beneath the moonlight. Stories filled with wisdom, culture, emotion, humanity, and transformation. Here we journey through the heart of Africa, through village paths, moonlit memories, forgotten truths, silent struggles, and the powerful lessons hidden inside ordinary lives. So, wherever you are listening from, sit close, relax, and journey with me. Sit close to the fire. The elders are about to speak. Because some stories do more than entertain us, they help us understand ourselves. This is Moonlight Tales Africa.
Before we begin today's story, kindly subscribe and become part of this growing circle of African history, wisdom, culture, and moonlight tales. Sit close to the fire. The elders are about to continue their story.
Waris Dirie, the desert flower who found her voice, the girl who ran. The desert was Waris Dirie's first classroom. There were no school bells, no paved roads, no easy tap to turn when she was thirsty. There was the sun, the sand, the animals, and the endless search for water and grazing land. Waris was born in Somalia into a nomadic family, and from a very young age, responsibility was simply part of life. She helped care for the family's goats and sheep, sometimes traveling long distances across the harsh landscape in search of water and grass. The desert taught her to watch, to endure, to keep moving, and perhaps without anyone knowing it, those early years were preparing Waris for a life in which she would have to keep moving even when the road ahead seemed impossible. Her name, Waris, is commonly translated as desert flower, and there could hardly have been a more fitting name, because desert flowers do not wait for perfect conditions. They find a way to bloom, but not every hardship in Waris's childhood came from nature. Some came from traditions that had existed for generations. When Waris was a young child, she underwent female genital mutilation, FGM. She would later speak openly about the experience and about the serious physical and emotional consequences it left behind. At that age, however, Waris could not understand why such suffering had been considered necessary. She only knew that it had happened to her and that it happened to other girls too. It was rarely questioned, rarely discussed, and protected by generations of silence. Waris survived, but she did not forget. Years later, that memory would become part of a much larger battle. For now, she was still simply a girl growing up in the desert, and another decision about her future was approaching. As Waris entered her teenage years, her father arranged for her to marry a man many years older than she was. Once again, tradition had spoken. Her future seemed settled, but something inside Waris refused to accept that the rest of her life had already been decided. She had a choice: stay and enter the marriage arranged for her, or leave everything she knew: home, family, security, the familiar desert landscape, and run towards a future she could not even see. Waris chose to run. With her mother's help, she escaped. There was no grand plan waiting on the other side, no money that could guarantee her safety, no certainty that she would even reach her destination, only determination. So Waris crossed the landscape she had known all her life, making her way towards Mogadishu and relatives who might help her. Think about that girl for a moment. She wasn't running towards fame. She knew nothing about fashion. She had never dreamed of international magazines or glamorous runways. She was running for something far more basic: the right to have a say in what happened to her own life. And perhaps that was Waris Dirie's first great act of becoming. Long before she found her public voice, she had already learned how to say no with her feet. Eventually, Waris reached Mogadishu, and there another door opened. An uncle who was serving as a Somali diplomat was going to London. Waris traveled with his family to work in their household. Suddenly, everything changed. The girl who had grown up beneath the enormous African sky found herself surrounded by the streets and buildings of London. A different climate, a different culture, a different language, and almost everything familiar had disappeared. She had little formal education and very limited English. For several years, she worked in her relative's home. Then came another turning point. Her uncle's diplomatic posting ended. The family was returning to Somalia. Waris was expected to go back with them. Once again, life placed two roads before her. One led backwards to everything she knew. The other led into uncertainty. And once again, Waris chose uncertainty. She stayed in London. Now she was largely on her own. No glamorous career awaited her. She had to survive. She found ordinary work. She began learning English and trying to build a life in a country she was only beginning to understand. Day by day, word by word, opportunity by opportunity. The girl who had once walked across the desert searching for water was now navigating another kind of wilderness, a huge foreign city. But Waris already understood something about difficult landscapes. You keep moving, and then in the middle of that very ordinary struggle, something extraordinary happened. Someone looked at the young woman working to make ends meet and saw something Waris herself had never imagined: a face that could travel around the world, a presence the camera would love, a future she didn't even know existed. The desert flower was about to be discovered, but fame would only reveal Waris Dirie's face. Her greatest journey was still ahead, because eventually she would discover her voice. The desert flower who found her voice when the world saw her face. Sometimes life changes with a single encounter. For Waris Dirie, that encounter came in London. She was still trying to find her place in a world far removed from the Somali desert. She was learning English, working ordinary jobs, trying to survive. There was nothing about her circumstances that suggested international fame was waiting nearby. But someone noticed her. British photographer Terence Donovan, one of the most respected fashion photographers of his generation, saw something extraordinary in the young Somali woman. The face, the bone structure, the presence, the quiet intensity. To Waris, the world of professional modeling was almost completely unfamiliar. But suddenly a door had appeared, and Waris stepped through it. It was not as simple as waking up one morning and becoming famous. Waris had entered an industry she barely understood. There were new expectations, new people, new places, and a language she was still learning. But once again, the skills the desert had taught her became useful. Observe, learn, adapt, keep moving. Before long, the woman who had once herded animals beneath the Somali sun was standing before professional cameras. Then came bigger opportunities, fashion assignments, international travel, magazine features, runways. Her distinctive beauty attracted attention, and Waris's career began to rise. She appeared in the celebrated Pirelli calendar, photographed by Terence Donovan. She modeled for major international brands. She traveled through the fashion capitals of the world. And in 1987, she appeared in the James Bond film The Living Daylights. The transformation seemed almost unbelievable. Somalia, London, fashion, film, international recognition. The little girl from the desert had entered a world she could never have imagined. But there was an irony hidden inside Waris Dirie's success. The fashion world was fascinated by her body. People photographed it, dressed it, styled it, celebrated it. But Waris knew something about that body that they did not. She knew the suffering it had carried since childhood. The consequences of FGM had not disappeared simply because her circumstances had changed. Beautiful clothes could cover the past. They could not erase it. Success could change her surroundings. It could not change what had happened. And eventually, Waris sought medical help for some of the lasting physical consequences she had endured. For perhaps the first time, she began to understand more fully that what had happened to her as a child was not something she simply had to accept in silence. That understanding mattered because silence had followed Waris from the desert, but silence was beginning to lose its hold. As her career grew, people naturally became interested in her story. How had this Somali woman arrived here? How had someone from such an unlikely beginning entered one of the world's most glamorous industries? It was the perfect fashion story, the desert girl who became a model, the extraordinary journey from poverty to glamour. But Waris knew there was another story, a much more difficult one. And eventually, in 1997, journalist Laura Ziv interviewed Waris for Marie Claire. The expected subject was her remarkable life and modeling career. But Waris decided that if people truly wanted to know who she was, then they needed to know more than the beautiful version. She spoke publicly about undergoing FGM as a child. She spoke about the suffering. She spoke about the silence surrounding the practice. And she spoke because she knew that somewhere another little girl was growing up in circumstances similar to her own. This time, Waris was no longer that powerless child. She had something she had never possessed then, a platform, and she decided to use it. Imagine the risk. For years, the world had celebrated Waris for how she looked. Now she was asking that same world to listen to something uncomfortable. She could have remained inside the safety of her successful career. She could have kept the past private. No one could have demanded otherwise. But Waris understood something powerful. Sometimes surviving is only the beginning. There comes a moment when survival asks another question. What will you do with the life you fought so hard to keep? Waris answered that question by speaking. The interview attracted enormous attention. Suddenly, conversations that had often remained hidden inside communities were entering magazines, homes, and public debate. People who had never heard the term female genital mutilation began asking questions, and Waris kept talking, not because speaking about the past was easy, but because silence could no longer protect the future. That same year, another extraordinary chapter began. The United Nations recognized that Waris could bring something to the campaign against FGM that statistics alone could never provide. She had lived it, she had survived it, and now she could speak about it in a way the world could understand. Waris Dirie became a United Nations Special Ambassador for the elimination of female genital mutilation. Think about that journey. Once, decisions about Waris's own body and future had been made without her voice. Now, her voice was reaching the world. The girl who had once run because she had so little power over her own destiny was now standing before international audiences, speaking for girls who could not yet speak for themselves. And perhaps this was the moment when Waris Dirie truly understood. The face that had made her famous had given her a platform, but the platform was never going to be the destination. It was going to become a bridge between the silent little girl she had once been and countless other girls whose stories remained unheard. Waris Dirie had found her voice. Now she had to decide what she was going to do with it. When her voice became her purpose, Waris Dirie had spent much of her life moving across the Somali desert, away from a marriage she did not choose, across continents, through the unfamiliar streets of London, onto fashion runways, into the pages of international magazines. But now she was moving towards something different, purpose. For years, Waris had been known for her face. Now she wanted the world to hear her voice. And she had something important to say. In 1998, Waris published her memoir, Desert Flower. For the first time, readers around the world encountered the fuller story behind the famous model. Not simply the photographs, not simply the fashion, but the child, the desert, the escape, the struggle, the pain she had carried, and the extraordinary road that had brought her from Somalia to the international stage. Desert Flower became an international bestseller and was translated into many languages. Years later, her story would also be adapted into a feature film. But Waris was no longer interested merely in telling people what had happened to her. She wanted change because every time she told her story, she knew that somewhere another girl was approaching the age when the same practice might be inflicted upon her. For Waris, that knowledge made silence impossible. Her work with the United Nations gave her an international platform to campaign against female genital mutilation. She traveled, she spoke, she met political leaders, campaigners, and communities. She challenged people to examine a practice that had often been defended simply because it was old. And Waris carried a simple but powerful truth into those conversations. Tradition should never require the suffering of a child. Her campaign was not against Africa. It was not against families. It was not against culture itself. It was against a harmful practice affecting girls in communities across several parts of the world. And Waris understood something important. Many mothers who continued the practice were themselves survivors of it. Many families acted because generations had taught them that this was what respectable families were supposed to do. Breaking such a cycle required more than condemnation, it required education, conversation, courage, and people within communities willing to say, it can stop with us. Waris continued that work beyond her role with the United Nations. In 2002, she established what became the Desert Flower Foundation, dedicated to ending FGM and supporting those affected by it. Her name had once opened doors in fashion. Now she used that recognition to open different doors. Doors to governments, International organizations, media platforms, communities, and conversations that had remained closed for generations, the Desert Flower movement would go on to support awareness campaigns and initiatives for survivors, including access to specialized care. The woman who once had so little control over what happened to her own body had become an advocate for the bodily autonomy and protection of girls. That transformation is perhaps one of the most remarkable parts of Waris Dirie's story. She could not rewrite her childhood, but she could help challenge the conditions that might shape another child's. And Waris was not alone. Across Africa and around the world, survivors, community leaders, health professionals, activists, governments, and international organizations were increasingly challenging FGM. Laws were strengthened in many countries, campaigns expanded, communities began abandoning the practice. The silence was being broken. The struggle was far from over. Millions of girls and women around the world have still been affected by FGM, and girls remain at risk today. But something has changed. The practice that once hid behind silence is now openly challenged on the international stage, and among the voices that helped force the world to pay attention was that of a woman named Waris Dirie. There is something deeply remarkable about her journey. Because Waris could have allowed the world to know only the glamorous version of her story, the beautiful model, the photographs, the runways, the celebrity, that story would have been easier. But Waris chose the harder story. She returned to the part of her life she might understandably have wanted to leave behind and used it to illuminate something larger than herself. That is courage of another kind. Not the courage to pretend the past never happened, but the courage to face it and refuse to let it have the final word. Perhaps that is why her name feels almost prophetic. Waris, desert flower. A flower in the desert does not bloom because the desert suddenly becomes gentle. The heat remains, the dry earth remains, the difficult conditions remain. Yet somehow life pushes through, and perhaps becoming is like that too. We do not always get to choose the soil into which we are born. We do not choose every tradition we inherit. We do not choose every wound life gives us. But there may come a moment when we are able to choose what happens next. Waris chose. She chose to run when others had chosen her future. She chose to learn when education had barely been available to her. She chose to step through an unexpected door when opportunity appeared. She chose to speak when silence would have been easier. And finally, she chose to turn visibility into responsibility. The world first noticed Waris Dirie because of her face. But that was never the greatest thing about her. Her beauty opened a door. Her courage gave that door meaning, and her voice carried her far beyond the runway. From a little girl walking beneath the burning Somali sun to a woman standing before the world saying, another girl deserves a different story, and maybe that is the legacy of the desert flower. Not simply that she survived harsh ground, but that having found a way to bloom, she used her voice to make the ground safer for the flowers coming after her. And that is the becoming of Waris Dirie. And perhaps that is what Waris Dirie's life teaches us. The desert does not promise the flower an easy place to grow. It gives it heat, wind, and unforgiving ground. Yet somehow the flower rises. So when life places you in difficult soil, remember the girl whose name meant flower of the desert. She could not choose where her story began, but with courage she changed where it would lead. And under this moon, may we remember, some flowers bloom despite the desert, others bloom and change the desert itself.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, comment, and share so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.